welcome to Maths on the Move, the podcast from plus.maths.org. I'm Marianne.
I'm Justin Chen.
And I'm Rachel Thomas. We're having a very exciting start to the summer here at plus.maths.org. We are currently split across multiple locations. Marianne, how is life in sunny Seville?
Well, it's definitely sunny and very hot, and it's very interesting and exciting because I'm at the European Congress of Mathematics, which is taking place in Seville all of this week. There's about 1,300 or more mathematicians gathered together here from all across Europe and beyond, talking about the latest advances in mathematics in Europe. And yeah, literally everything is covered here, from pure mathematics, of course, to data science. I just saw there's a symposium even on financial mathematics. There is all flavors of maths are happening here. And the talks have been really, really interesting so far.
So what have some of your highlights been from the week?
So I really liked a talk by Avi Widgerson, who won the Abel Prize. I think it was 2021 that he won it. And we've met him before at the Heidelberg Laureate Forum, and he just gave a fantastic talk about what happens if you introduce sort of probability into proofs. So you're not requiring proofs that are 100% certain, but you're allowing yourself to there to be some errors in it. So there's a small chance that the proof isn't actually correct. And then once you allow that, all sorts of weird things can happen. So for example, there are these things called zero knowledge proofs, which basically means that I can convince you of something without you actually learning anything from my proof. So as an intuitive example would be, I could convince you that I know where a treasure is hidden without letting you know where it is. So that would be like an intuitive example. So once you allow proofs to contain some error, so you're only sure that a proof is correct with a certain very high probability, then you can show, for example, that every single mathematical result can be transferred into a zero knowledge proof, which is quite something. So, and I interviewed Avi, and there will be a podcast coming out later in the summer with this interview. So
excellent. And Avi won the Turing Prize this year, didn't he?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, he won the Turing Prize as well this year. So, yeah, it's definitely a bit of a superstar. Another talk I really enjoyed was by Marianne, British mathematician, very well known, so I thought, it's algebra, and algebra is something that I normally don't get on with that well. But it was a fantastic talk trying to figure out, or talking about how if you have an infinite group, so there are these algebraic objects called groups that Justin has been writing about, and they can be finite or infinite, and it's like, how can you sort of recognize an infinite group by some finite image, some finite information about it? And he just used these, he gives really fun talks, and he kept saying, like, so what happens if you find a group in the gutter? You pick it up, you dust it off, you clean it up. How can you actually tell that it's perhaps the same as your favorite group? So that was a really interesting talk as well.
And it's lovely to hear that we can save groups from the gutter. That's very reassuring.
Yes, he also said at some point he was talking about a group. I can't quite remember what it was, but he wanted to say that it's actually a proper group. It's not in some way degenerate or something like that. And he said, I'm talking about a proper full-size group that is allowed to drink alcohol.
Oh, he sounds great. I can't wait to hear more from your coverage of that. We've got some things. So you've already written up some articles about some of the prizes that were announced at the ECM, but then looks like we're going to have some more coverage coming out later in the summer or in the autumn.
Yeah, definitely. So that's the other interesting thing. So the European Mathematical Society gives out a range of prizes, and 10 of those go to young mathematicians under the age of 35. And they're very prestigious. And as we've already noted, Rachel, that quite a few winners of these prizes then go on to win Fields medals. So they're definitely a good indicator. So yeah, we've got articles about 2 prize winners, and we'll find out some more. And actually one of the EMS prize winners is a woman called Nina Holden, who is the niece of Helge Holden, who is somebody we've interviewed before and is a mathematician we know. So that's quite pleasing.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
We interviewed, I'll put a link in the show notes. We did an interview with Helge at the International Congress of Mathematicians in, was it 2022? Which was quite an unusual setting. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Oh, that sounds great. Well, I'm glad Seville is treating you well. I hear some dancing has been happening there. So
yes, dancing has happened as well, quite late at night. But, you know, there wouldn't be a maths conference without some late night shenanigans.
Exactly. And Justin, as we mentioned in an earlier podcast, you're working with us over the summer. You're doing some great work improving our coverage on group theory, as Marianne mentioned. And yesterday we went together to an event in London about generative AI, generative artificial intelligence, something often in the news at the moment. And that was one of these open for business events that the Newton Gateway runs. And the aim of those is to link researchers from a research program. In this case, it's a satellite program run jointly by the Isaac Newton Institute in Cambridge and the Alan Turing Institute in London, which connects researchers from that program with researchers in industry. We went to that generative AI event. What things caught your interest from that event, Justin?
Yes, we went down to London to go to this event, and it was not quite as far as Seville, but it was fun to take the train down and hear all these wonderful speakers talk. And one of the talks I really enjoyed was Transformers for Scientific Machine Learning by Andrew Stewart. And he talks about how we want to use AI models to predict natural phenomena such as the weather, but the weather can be really complicated and hard to predict, as I'm sure you know if you looked at a weather forecast. One of the ways it can be hard to predict is because, for example, the flapping of a butterfly's wings in Japan can cause a hurricane in Mexico a couple months down the line. And this is an example of weather being what's called non-local. And his talk was about how transformers are one way for AI to learn non-local causation and to help us predict things like the weather.
It was a great talk, wasn't it? I thought he was an excellent speaker.
Yeah, for sure. Another talk I really enjoyed was a talk on actual causality by Hannah Chocolor from King's College, London. And a lot of her talk was on defining the concept of causality, which I never really thought about. But for example, let's say it rains and then I get wet. We can say the rain caused me to get wet because of something called counterfactual reasoning. If it didn't rain, then I wouldn't have gotten wet. So we can say that the rain caused me to get wet. But now let's say it rained and I got splashed by a car and I got wet. If it didn't rain, I would have still gotten splashed by the car and gotten wet. And if I didn't get splashed by the car, I still would have gotten wet from the rain. So how can we say that the rain and getting splashed by the car caused me to get wet? So her talk was about a framework called actual causality and how this more rigorous definition of causality can help us understand AI better.
Yeah, it was so interesting, this idea. And she was saying, a lot of these ideas are from philosophy, but the fact that it can actually help you can use this framework that you were saying to help understand perhaps what's the black boxes of AI, how they're making their decisions. What were the sort of particular key things that caused them to make their decisions? It was great, wasn't it? Hopefully we'll talk to her or to Andrew over the summer, and we'll have some future coverage on that event.
Yeah, for sure. It would be great to talk to them some more and learn more about what they have to say.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to finding out more about this. So that sounds very exciting. You've been doing very interesting things. What else have you been working on, Rachel?
Well, today, just before I'm speaking to you both, I was interviewing David Hughes, who's one of the organisers of one of the big 6-month-long research programs at the Isaac Newton Institute. And that one is on something called anti-diffusive dynamics. So I think most of us kind of have a picture in our head of what diffusion is. So, for example, if you had black coffee and you have some milk and you pour the milk into the coffee, the milk diffuses through the coffee and it mixes together. And so he was saying, diffusion always happens, even in anti-diffusive systems, but sometimes there's these processes that can cause this thing called anti-diffusion, where instead of things spreading out, things actually sharpen and you actually get some sort of structures that emerge. And understanding when this happens and how to describe it mathematically it's not really well understood, even though it's been observed for I think he said since the 70s. And we see it in applications like Justin was saying. We see it in weather and climate science. Here there's anti-diffusion causes these density staircases in the ocean, and other place that we've all seen is the bands in the atmosphere on the surface of Jupiter. That's another example of anti-diffusive process. And also it has fascinating, the phenomena appears in these fascinating things like plasma science, like building plasma fusion reactors. And even in like the flocking of birds, the way you describe flocking of birds, you can think of as an anti-diffusive system. So that chat was really brilliant. I'm currently digesting it, and stay tuned for our coverage of that later in the summer or early in the autumn.
Yeah, it sounds great. I'm looking forward to that. It will be very interesting. Bird flocking also came up in this conference as well, because it's always a very interesting mathematical phenomenon. So I am very lucky because the conference here will be finished tomorrow and I'm going to have a holiday. So since we're all slightly winding down or getting ready for the summer, I was wondering, is there any summer reading or listening that you'd recommend, Rachel?
Well, speaking of bird flocking, for listening, I'd recommend the 2 podcasts we did with the mathematician Yang-Wei He, and he told us such fascinating story that we had to spread it over 2 podcasts. One was how string theory ties together black holes, quantum gravity, and number theory. And he had this great quote about last century was about geometry's impact on physics, and this century it will be about number theory's impact on physics. And the second podcast is about how we used AI to develop new maths, in particular, something called the murmuration conjecture, that predicts patterns in the prime numbers that resemble flocks of birds. So bird flocking is an eternal theme in mathematics. And for reading, I'd recommend our recent article called How to Improve Mathematics, which is based on another recent event at the Isaac Newton Institute about celebrating the 60th birthday of Tim Gowers. And not only does it cover some of Tim's maths that he did with colleagues, including a fellow Fields medalist, Terence Tao, but it also explores some of the really innovative ways they've both explored in how we do mathematics and how they're really changing the way how mathematics is done nowadays. So it's a good read. It's a really interesting story. Justin, while you've been working on Plus, have you come across any podcasts or articles you'd recommend?
This week, I've been writing an article about fractals, and so I've been reading through many of the past Plus articles on fractals, and I found this really cool article called Fractal Photo Finish, and it's about Julia sets, which are these fractals that are very closely related to the Mandelbrot set, and it's about how any picture or any simple 2D curve can be approximated however precisely we want by Julia sets. And I've also been reading this book called Collision, Stories from the Science of CERN. And it's this project that paired together scientists from CERN and writers of short stories. And each scientist would tell the writer about a piece of science they were working on, and the writer would sort of interpret that into a fiction short story. And I thought it was such a great idea. For example, the first story in the collection is about when we were searching for the Higgs boson back in the early 2000s. There was a lot of things that went wrong when we were searching for it. There was a collider in the US that suddenly ran out of funding. And when we were building the Large Hadron Collider, there was suddenly like something wrong with the magnets, and it never quite recovered. It only ran at 13 TeV in the end instead of 14 TeV. And so there started being this theory going around that the Higgs boson didn't want to be found, that somehow it could reverse causation and any event leading to the Higgs boson being found would sort of be erased from the timeline, and we would go down a different timeline of the Higgs not being found. So the first short story is about these scientists that were, so the Higgs boson did end up being found, so the theory wasn't correct. But the first short story is about these scientists who are about to find dark matter, and the universe decides that no, you can't, dark matter doesn't want to be found. So they start getting erased from the world gradually. And it's a bit creepy, but I thought it was a really cool interaction between science and writing and the arts.
That sounds great. I'm going to look that up. We'll put links to all of these in the show notes. Marianne, what will you be reading or listening to when you're on the beach next week?
Well, so one thing I will be rereading is an article that you wrote, Rachel, about Avi Widgerson, who I mentioned earlier. And the article is called "It's Good to Have Hard Problems," because that's what he said back then when you, was it an interview you did with him?
Yeah, I think it was his about his Abel Prize, I think.
Yes. Oh, yes. It was when on the occasion of him receiving the Abel Prize, you wrote that article. So I'm definitely going to be rereading this because he's done amazing things. And another thing I will reread is to do with billiard theory. So mathematicians like billiards, or pool, as you might call it, but they're looking at an abstracted version of it. So you have balls that are basically point particles, and they have no mass, and there's no friction, so things keep moving forever. And then you can ask yourself, what happens if you play it on a rectangular table? What if the table is triangular? What if it's round? What happens? What can the ball do? You know, there can be periodic behavior or more chaotic behavior. So I find that really, really interesting. And actually, after talking to you now, I'm going to go off and interview a mathematician about his work on mathematical billiards. So the article that I'd recommend is called "Chaos on the Billiard Table," and it's on PLUS.
So in addition to mathematicians always getting up to trouble late at night at conferences, they also play theoretical billiards.
Exactly. Exactly. And for listening, I also had a recommendation in case you'd rather listen than to read something. So there's this great podcast that, Rachel, you did an interview with your friend Ollie Freak. It's called From Clicks to Chords, and it's about music, and I love it because, you know, we often talk about how maths and music are related, and you can explain how they are related. But for me, that was always quite an abstract thing. You know, how does sound relate to mathematics? But in that podcast, it really comes to life because there's audio clips really showing you how that happens. So I really like that one.
That was great fun. Ollie he's our music correspondent now, isn't he? And it's kind of like magic, actually. Hearing things go from clicking sounds to musical notes is really crazy. So yeah, it's definitely a good one. Well, I hope you find something in those recommendations for your summer holiday reading and listening. That's it for this podcast, and we'll have a break over the summer while we all go and drink cold drinks on sandy beaches. But we'll be back in the autumn with more interviews with researchers and more news from the people who make mathematics happen. So thanks for listening, and bye for now. Bye.
Bye.